Hi, and welcome everyone to this morning's Think-In. I hope everyone has grabbed a coffee. I'm Alexi Mostrous, an editor and partner at Tortoise Media. We're delighted to be hosting this morning's discussion in collaboration with Capita, and its title is The Great Opportunity for Government, How to Capitalize on Innovation. Before we start, I should say a bit about the wider Great Opportunity Project, which is a really brilliant initiative organised by Capita, and in particularly by Ollie Freestone and Rosie Dawkins. And it's centred around a YouGov survey that started last year, and each quarter surveys hundreds of leaders across three pillars: government, financial services, and critical infrastructure. And its results give a pretty unrivaled insight into leader sentiment around the pandemic and whether businesses can emerge stronger as a result of some of the lessons learned. And no sector is more important within the context of this discussion than the government. So we're not, usually we spend about 10 minutes going through some slides that we prepare for each Think-In, but I think because we want the conversation this morning to focus around innovation, I'm just going to show the first two slides of that YouGov survey, which highlight an interesting paradox in how the government reacted, or the government sector reacted to COVID. So Ellen O'Connor, if we could just bring up the first slide, you'll see that the majority of government decision makers said, perhaps unsurprisingly, that their organization had changed significantly in the last 12 months. And elsewhere in the survey, in a slide that we're not going to show you today, some of the government leaders basically said that the change was happening too fast, and that they wished that the change had been more manageable and less disruptive. But paradoxically, if we go to the second slide, you'll see that most senior government decision makers said their organizations had become more or equally open to collaboration or to new ideas. And only a tiny fraction said that innovation had actually decreased. So you have this picture emerging of a kind of melting pot of pressure, out of which certain really innovative changes have been made. So this discussion today is about how that potential shift ties into some of the thinking around innovation and government innovation, as expressed, for example, in the recent Mackintosh report, which pointed out that the UK public sector is already a remarkable source of innovation. So two questions that I hope we can discuss today is, firstly, how can we properly harness public sector innovation? And secondly, whether there are any lessons to be learned from COVID that can help private sector companies and the government sector come together to help harness what I am told are called intangible knowledge assets. To discuss this, we're joined by no fewer than four great guests today. Hetty Barkworth-Nanton is the Chief Executive of Ploughshare Innovations. Good morning, Hetty. Patrick Elliott, Chief Strategy and Product Officer for Government Services at Capita. Professor Sir Ian Boyd, Chair of the UK Research Integrity Office, former Chief Scientific Advisor to DEFRA, and a non-exec at Ferra Science Limited, which is a Capita government collaboration. And lastly, Charles Price, Deputy Director of Knowledge Assets at BEIS, and part of the team that helped put together the Mackintosh report. Just before we go to our panel, it's worth pointing out that like any Think-In, this is supposed to be a collaborative discussion. It's not just supposed to be us listening or the audience listening to our esteemed panelists. We want to hear your point of view, how you think innovation is being best served. If you're working in a government department, or if you're close to that sort of activity, comment in the chat, please. My colleague Ellen is managing the chat, and we will try and bring you into the conversation. And the idea is, by the end of the hour, we come to a more sophisticated understanding of a complex topic by hearing your point of view. So please do contribute if you want. Okay, let's get started. Charles, can we come to you first? Tell us just set out the groundwork, if you will, please. Just say a little bit about the Mackintosh report. What were the conclusions of the report, and how you see government and innovation, particularly post-COVID?
Yeah, thank you very much, Alexi, for that intro. So we'll talk about innovation today. We had two, I guess, perspectives in the Mackintosh report that we wanted to bring together. The first was working with some fairly recent economic concepts about the importance of intangible assets. Historically, when people thought about assets, they thought about buildings, factories, machinery, etc. But increasingly, the economy is built on what's known as intangible assets. So these are things like intellectual property, know-how, research and development investments. And there's actually developed quite a rich kind of set of views on that with regard to the private sector, but much less in the public sector. Now, of course, it turns out that within the public sector, we also have developed some very, very impressive R&D capabilities through our research labs, for example, in the MOD or FERA, you mentioned earlier, National Physical Laboratory. So we also in the public sector have a lot of intangible assets, knowledge assets. The second perspective that we had in our report was just case studies. So the heart of the report was case studies. I'd recommend that people read those to kind of really get the kind of the flavour of what we're trying to get across in the Mackintosh report. And we concluded in that work that there are a lot of value in these assets. The number that we calculated was the value is around 100 billion in value for the taxpayer, and we had some recommendations about some more work we can do to spotlight that value to bring it out into the economy for the benefit of citizens.
Sorry, just explain the 100 billion figure again. How did you arrive at that, and what's that based on?
So the approach we took on that was looking at accrued investments into things like R&D, intellectual property, human capital. We looked at the accrued investments into that asset class over a period of a number of years and apply some depreciation factors. And that's how we reached the 100 billion figure. As a methodology, it was based on an approach taken by a European Commission study actually called SPINTAN, that has done similar work across the public sectors in a number of European countries.
And presumably the government has been thinking about how to harness innovation and intangible assets for a while. Do you think the Mackintosh report will mark a turning point in the approach? And who's going to have to lead the change in respect of driving forward the recommendations from the report?
So I think it is a turning point, actually, in many ways. Now, I don't think it's just going to be the Mackintosh report that changes it. I think there's a turning point now in terms of top-level ministerial ambition in this area. So Boris Johnson has set out a vision for the UK to be a science superpower. The Chancellor is very, very focused on building entrepreneurialism within the UK. The Mackintosh sets out some theoretical frameworks and actions within the public sector. Ministers in BEIS are shortly going to be publishing some strategies in this regard. So what's interesting about this point in time is that there's a kind of coalescence of strategies coming out that are basically pointing in the same direction, and that's all against the backdrop of course, coming out of COVID, which is, as you set out in your opening slide, has kind of brought to light some really interesting new ways of working, new technologies, and so forth.
Let's talk about COVID in a second, and let's also come back to the Mackintosh report in a bit, because I want to explore the three pillars that I think that it sets out: good practice, incentives, and support. But just before we go to the other guests, can you tell me, in the Mackintosh report and in general, what is the role of the private sector?
So it's pretty diverse. I would say so it's difficult to generalize, But one perception I'd have is that great innovation often comes from collaboration, very rich collaborations across different fields and silos. One of the areas we looked at quite closely in producing our recommendations was actually the university ecosystems that have prospered in the UK in the last 20 years in terms of bringing together entrepreneurialism, great science ideas, and we're starting to see some really fabulous startups come out of that system. So I think for all of us, whether we're in the public sector or the private sector or the university sector, what really turbocharges innovation is creating these very rich collaborations and working across different silos.
Do you see, as a civil servant and as a public official, any danger in an increasing number of private public collaborations? Is there anything that could be lost by the addition of the private sector into an innovation strategy?
So I think that there are always risks to any model that needs to be brought through. The one that comes to mind most clearly, or one of the kind of risks that comes to mind most clearly, is if you take NHS data. That's clearly a huge value for the UK and patients and patient benefits, but there are also big risks about how that asset is managed, and if it gets into the wrong hands in the wrong way, then there are clearly risks there.
Okay, well, maybe we can talk about that balance slightly later on. And if anyone in the chat has any views upon on that balance and how to handle the relationship between risk and reward, then join in the debate. But can we turn to Hetty now, please, CEO of Ploughshare. And Hetty, I was looking on your website this morning, and some of the inventions you've been involved in, or your company's been involved in, sound like they could have come out of Q's laboratory in a James Bond film. You've got explosive door breaching technologies and ultra hard steel armor. Is it as cool as it sounds?
It is absolutely as cool as it sounds. So don't forget that we work with DSTL, the Defence Science and Technology Labs down at Down, and we have access to a vast array of innovation from right across the spectrum: life sciences, some of the stuff that you just described. We have access to cyber technology. Pretty much there's nothing that we don't touch.
Can you just explain, for anyone that doesn't know what Ploughshare does, the basic setup that you've got?
Yeah, so in very simple terms, what we do is we work, we are a subsidiary of DSTL, and we have access to all of the intellectual property that is identified and comes out of the work that gets done in DSTL, and indeed wider mod, and indeed increasingly other government departments as well. And we take that intellectual property and we effectively work to put it into the hands of users. And we put it into the hands of users in two fundamental ways, although there could be others. The first is that we will license it to existing organisations, to existing ventures who will in themselves invest in that technology and take it to market. The other way we do it, if we believe that it's a groundbreaking technology or it's very disruptive, we will create our own venture, so our own spin out, and that spin out will in turn then invest in that technology and take it to market. So two simple ways in which we take innovation out of the lab and into the hands of users and ultimately driving benefit.
And what is, explain for a bit how the profit motive of a private company it interacts with a government desire to drive forward innovation. What are Ploughshare's incentives?
Really interesting question. So let's take an example of a innovation that we license out to an organization. So we had an innovation that was providing leading edge fingerprint capability in terms of identification of fingerprints, which in fact have been done in collaboration between Government Lab in DSTL and Loughborough University. So in fact, it brought in the academic sector as well. Out of that, we then licensed that capability, which was relatively early in its development, to a company called Foster & Freeman. Foster & Freeman's job that their business is to sell capability into the police and others for forensic identification. And so we licensed the capability to Foster and Freeman. They paid us an upfront license fee, and they also committed to ongoing royalty payments as they then start to take that capability to market. So what they get out of that is a groundbreaking technology that otherwise they wouldn't have access to. They invest in it themselves because they see that it's worth it, and they see that it's worth it because they know that there's a huge marketplace out there for that technology and innovation. They then take that innovation out to market. They clearly make profits in terms of the way in which they do that, and they bring that then brings a marginal royalty back to Ploughshare and subsequently the public sector. But the real benefit actually is in the impact on society that the capability has that Foster and Freeman puts into the market. The impact is on the economy because we get GVA growth as a result. They create jobs as a result, and for them it increases their profit. So it's a win-win-win.
And you heard Charles talk about a turning point in the UK government's attitude towards innovation. Are you also seeing a turning point? Are you also seeing a greater emphasis on supporting ventures that seek to stimulate innovation?
So we are definitely seeing an increased interest and desire across MOD and again across other government departments in wanting to do some of this stuff. And the interest, I think, is primarily driven by the drive across government for the prosperity agenda, and also the need to be able to demonstrate that with the increased investment in R&D, that outcomes and impact is being delivered. So I think that's driving a real interest increase that we've seen over the course of the last year that is very different to what we saw in the last sort of 5 to 10 years.
Right, so that in the last sort of 12 months, there's been a sea change compared to maybe the last decade. And
yeah, absolutely.
How much of that is down to COVID, do you think?
Oh, I think the two beautifully collided, if I'm honest. I think what COVID has done with things like the vaccine generation, the vaccine development, etc., is I think it has shown, so I think the desire was already there with government, and we saw that, in a lot of the inputs that went into the spending review last year, the signalling was already there. And indeed, the conversations that turned into ARIA have been going on for a number of years. But I think what COVID did, and specifically actually the vaccine development, is it sort of showed the public sector what can be done in a crisis. And there's some real excitement and buzz coming out of that I think has probably helped to fuel an already established agenda. That's my view. Okay,
well, we'll maybe explore a little bit more about the impacts of COVID later on, but let me come to Professor Sir Ian Boyd. You've had very high profile and influential positions within government, and now you're involved in, amongst other things, in Fairer Science, which is a joint venture between Capita and the government. Tell us a bit about Fairer Science and what it does, and how the collaboration, what the collaboration says about how the government and the private sector can work together in terms of innovation.
Well, thank you. And Fairer Science is essentially it's a joint venture. In effect, it's a kind of spin out of what was a government institution, which was called the Food and Environment Research Agency, which is the origin of the name Fairer. And basically, it was an institution that government at the time, which was in between about 2012 and 2015, couldn't make work. It really just couldn't make the numbers add up. And the reasons for that actually go back a long time in history. I'm not quite sure whether I want to go into it, but it goes right back to something called the Rothschild Report of 1971, which essentially said that all the major research infrastructure that the government had built up since the Second World War was really going to be marketized, and that government departments would contract the marketplace for the research they needed. Now, There were certain exceptions to that, and certain things survived. But between about 1971 and the end and the early 2000s, there was a continuous process of disinvestment in research infrastructure that was owned by the public sector. And FERA was actually an amalgamation of lots and lots of different research institutes that DEFRA, or the Department of Agriculture and Fisheries before it, and the Department of the Environment before it, actually owned, and came together in something called the Central Science Laboratory, which is actually where FERA now sits, up at Sandhutton near York. And it's a very big facility. You go there, it's relatively new. If you go there, you'll be stunned by the size of it and the ambition that once existed to have public funded science in government. That all dissipated very, very quickly. Government couldn't find the funding to sustain something like FERA, and a new solution was required. That solution was a joint venture with Capita. I was actually in the role of being the assigned officer to try and make that transfer happen, and it happened, and I believe it's been very effective and very successful. But it's about really levering on the marketplace in order to supply public services which the government actually needs in the national interest. And I think we need to think much more broadly than we have in the past in order to be able to do that in areas like research and innovation.
So tell me specifically about how the how Capita coming on board, or indeed any private company, I suppose, coming on board helped you do things at FERA which you couldn't do before. Can you just unpack that a bit?
Yeah, I mean, to put it bluntly, Capita took about a third of the cost out of the business, right, and actually maintained or improved the service. So, you know, that was the private sector at work, just simply because they had well-tried business processes that they introduced and implemented, which were actually pretty tough, especially for those who were used to civil service type of culture, moving to a private sector culture. Some people in the organization simply just couldn't take it and didn't survive. Many have done and are, I think, now flourishing. But that was fundamentally it. It's the systems, it's the focus and the systems and the business processes that make a huge difference. I mean, it's hard to know why the public sector can't do that. Perhaps the incentives just aren't right, I think.
If you're talking about that sort of transformation, how did that transformation to focuses and to systems and to the business processes make FERA more resilient to what has happened in the last 18 months in terms of the pandemic? Has it had any effect?
I think it's bound to have had an effect. It's quite hard to say. I don't have a counterfactual to point to that is, that says that actually FERA has done better than something else. But actually, I think that the fact that you've got an efficient business, you've got motivated people, is going to make a huge difference to how you weather, something like the COVID-19 pandemic. And certainly FERA has done remarkably well through that. It's been a very robust business. It's like all businesses, it was a bit of a roller coaster in a sense, but actually I think it's coming out of it extremely strongly.
Patrick, let's come to you on a related question, because obviously you work closely on the FERA project, but Capita is also involved in other joint ventures like Axelos. So tell us about, from your perspective, from Capita's perspective, how you can work with government to bolster innovation.
Thank you, Alexi, and good morning, everybody. Really echo a number of the points made by Ian, Hetty, and Charles previously. I think a lot of it's just about collaboration and bringing together the different skills that and expertise that players from the public sector and the private sector can each bring to making these initiatives successful. As Charles outlined, there's an enormous depth of knowledge and intellectual property and intangible assets that have just been built up in the course of government activity over many decades. And one particular example maybe that we haven't mentioned before that you just touched on there is Axelos, where going back literally several decades, because government runs big programs and transformations itself, it developed a number of methodologies. Some people listening to this call may be familiar with some of them, things like Prince2, MSP, ITIL, and so on. And those, it turns out, have significant value and are of great interest to many potential users in other governments around the world and in the private sector. And so Axelos was set up effectively to find a way to create more value from that large investment made essentially by the taxpayer over many decades in helping develop those methodologies. So back in 2013, a joint venture was set up between the Cabinet Office and Capita to seek to better commercialize and develop these methodologies on an international basis. And it's been very successful, greatly increasing the number of bodies that use these methodologies on a licensing basis, making them available to training organizations around the world. And right now they're used in over 150 countries across 19 languages and by over 90% of the largest businesses and organizations in the world. So I think, could that have been achieved without that partnership? I think probably not at that scale and not at that pace and not with the level of focus on really maximizing the return to the taxpayer. What did Capita bring? It brought an upfront investment. It brought sales, marketing, product management, commercialization, expertise. And I think it really was that fusion of the assets and capabilities developed in the public sector as so many decades with the ability to turn that into products and sell them to clients that Capita as the private sector partner brought. And I think, it's a similarly different story at FERA, and there's a number of other examples. I mean, Hetty gave a few examples in the defense sector. So I think there is a general pattern here, Alexi, and I think prior to the Mackintosh report coming out, in fact, Capita did produce its own analysis of this space, and we issued a report about 6 months ago on government venturing, which also looked at it internationally. And if you look around the world, there's a number of other countries that are arguably further ahead in this respect than the UK. Places like France, Malaysia, Canada, and others, where they're significantly further down the road in fostering this kind of partnership between the public and private sector around intangible assets and knowledge assets, recognizing that to deliver the best possible return on the investment taxpayers have made in these assets, appropriate partnerships with private sector bodies that can help bring them to market and commercialize them is very effective. And so we certainly see further opportunity to do this going forward. Charles mentioned over £100 billion worth of assets, most of which are not yet fully exploited or on which a return is actively being sought. So there has to be potential to do that going forwards.
Can you talk about any areas that you want to collaborate with the government in going forward in terms of that asset pile?
Well, I think we're just engaging in conversations now, including talking to Charles and others, to try to understand where the most promising areas lie. It's quite difficult, frankly, because as the Mackintosh report highlights, that historically there's probably not been quite as much focus on this as I suspect there will be going forwards. And it's not always well known exactly where the assets lie, what value they really have. I mean, as Charles said, you can value them based on what's been invested to create them, but that's not necessarily a very good guide of the value they might have in the market, which could be significantly more than that or potentially less than that. And a lot of that will depend on identifying customers willing to pay for them and working out the best way of exploiting and monetizing them. So as Capita, we certainly have a broad interest in this. I think we've built a good track record through FERA, Axelos, Construction Line, and a number of other similar examples where we've worked in partnership with government to try to develop commercial ventures that can deliver a return on these assets. But I think the first step, as again the Mackintosh report highlights, is that we've got to understand where the assets lie, what value they really have, what opportunity for commercialization exists, and then look at the appropriate ways of doing that. And there's a number of different ways. It doesn't have to be a joint venture. It could be licensing, as Hetty mentioned. It could be a wholesale divestment. There's a whole variety of different routes, and we also outline a number of those in our government venturing report. And it's got to be a case of what works best in each instance. I think there's no single answer to how this should best be done. And again, the international examples are helpful because they show a very wide variety of different approaches to this.
And do you think Capita and other private sector companies can and should get involved at an early stage to help the government identify what assets they've got that can be exploited before coming on board in the practical sense of how to exploit them?
I think yes. I mean, obviously, it's got to be done appropriately with proper respect for appropriate procurement process and so on. But I think there's certainly an upfront phase, which is much more exploratory, before anyone knows whether it's worth even progressing with trying to establish appropriate commercial arrangements, joint ventures or whatever. There's certainly, say, that upfront discovery and exploration phase, which is fairly well proven in the private sector in terms of anyone who's run innovation programs or ideation programs, going through the usual journey of trying to understand what's the addressable market, do we have the capability to solve problems for clients in that market, and does the business case stack up? That requires a fairly agile, iterative, fail-fast type approach before one gets to the point where you've identified, yes, there really does look like there's a potential opportunity here. And then it might be appropriate to switch across to a more formal procurement or tendering or bidding process before deciding what sort of vehicles to set up to exploit the opportunity. But I think there has to be an exploratory phase first before people commit. That's essential to make sure the business case stacks up.
And just before we turn back to Charles to ask him a little bit about COVID and the impacts of COVID, Patrick, what is the relevance of Capita's sale of both Axelos and Ferra?
Okay, so as with all of these sort of ventures, they go through several phases of their life cycle. I think Ian explained that Ferra had existed for, I think it's something like 100 years, if you go right back to the very original setup of the first government-owned science laboratory. So I think in our view, there is a natural sort of phasing to these things where a particular player like Capita can add the most value. And in the case of, say, Ferra or Axelos, it was that initial stage from going from, there's an asset, in the case of Ferra, a science laboratory, in the case of Axelos, some program management and IT management methodologies, where you need to transition them to the stage where they're viable businesses, they're growing, a commercial model has been proven, some products have been developed, but it's quite naturally you may then get to a stage of growth where different ownership structures and players are more appropriate, where maybe more access to a truly global market is required, where significant further investment might be required to take the next stage of growth. And therefore we see it's quite natural that at some point ownership will change, as it is with Axelos, both Cabinet Office and Capita divesting, and new owners will take the business forwards again. So I think you shouldn't certainly read into the fact that Capita is divesting both Ferra and Axelos is showing any lack of appetite for doing this sort of activity going forward. It's quite the opposite.
Hetty, I think, wants to make a point about private sector collaboration. Hetty, can we come to you and then to Charles?
Yeah, thank you. Really interesting. Thank you, Patrick, for those thoughts. One other perspective on private sector collaboration I want to put forward. So a lot of what we do historically in my world is what I would call technology push. So we're taking intellectual property that we're finding within the labs, and we are trying to marry it up with a requirement effectively in the public sector, in the private sector. I would like to see a lot more collaboration coming from the private sector, where the private sector are coming to us and saying, we have these challenges, how can you help? Because I'm utterly convinced that with that kind of narrative, we can go back into the labs and we can do a problem-orientated search for innovation, where I think we could actually find all sorts of stuff that we're not getting our hands on today. So I think it's a really important part of collaboration that often we miss, and I'd love to see a lot more of it.
That's really interesting. And is there a particular sector that applies to HETI? Is it you know, a police force? Oh no, I guess that's a public sector organisation. But is it? Can you give me an example of a private sector organisation that has come to you with a problem and then you'd be able to solve it?
But we haven't had any yet. That's
Right.
my point. It doesn't generally happen. Generally, when you look at tech transfer work across the country, it tends to be technology push. That's the model. And as I said, I'm utterly convinced that a much smarter model that is born of collaboration is around working collaboratively with the innovation units within the corporate world, and identifying what the problem statements are that they've got, what they need fixing, and then we can go look for the innovation. I just think it'd be a really interesting collaboration experiment and could bring huge benefit.
So, Patrick, let's just get your thoughts on that. What do you think? Technology pull versus technology push? Is that something Capita are thinking about?
I think you need both, as Hetty says. I think we've got to be very open-minded about this. There's no one size fits all, as I think Charles himself said earlier. I think you're just simply trying to decide what the best start point is difficult. I think, as Hetty said, you could, you know, the conventional approach is to find a customer problem that isn't solved or well solved, and then try to think of more creative solutions to it. But that can pull both ways, as Hetty says. I think if more private sector organisations perhaps had better awareness of some of the capabilities and IP that's sat in the public sector, it might be easier to reach out and say, well, that looks interesting, that might help us solve a problem. So I think, as I said earlier, I think the Mackintosh report is very helpful here, just surfacing what that know-how and expertise that exists in the public sector is, and making it more visible to private sector players who are looking for solutions to some of the problems that they see, has got to be helpful in this respect.
Charles, let's turn now to lessons from COVID, at least for a few minutes. I mean, I suppose the archetypal success in the last 12 months has come from Kate Bingham and the vaccine task force. And Kate Bingham is obviously has a background in venture capitalism. And in interviews that she's given, she's made some really interesting comments about how the public sector could innovate more effectively going forward by adopting what she calls a venture capital view of the world. So don't penny pinch, feel comfortable with risk, don't focus always on getting the cheapest price, and be comfortable with failure. Do you think realistically the government can and should adopt that sort of approach?
So risk is an interesting one. There are some areas where the government is a massive risk taker. So if you take the big steps forward, we're making fusion energy or genomic science. These are risks that the private sector themselves isn't willing to take right now. Although we're seeing increasing private sector capital attracted to those sectors. In terms of taking more of a venture capital approach, so the Chancellor is very focused on building the venture capital capability in the UK. There's a recent podcast that he did celebrating the role of venture capital approaches. My personal view is I think there are techniques and networks and enabling factors that you see in the venture capital community that organizations in the public sector can learn from, draw on, and when those go well, then you can create fabulous results. I was just in another context the other day. We were talking about the BBC microcomputer, the Acorn computer that came out in the 1980s. So BBC, public sector organisation, and they ran a procurement to kind of create this new computer, and it was Herman Hauser who won that and created a huge ecosystem around that innovation in the Cambridge area. The computer itself, I think, is in the museums right now, but a spin-off, a bit of intellectual property that came out of that was the basis of ARM, the the technology company. I think it's probably one of the UK's most successful technology companies. So I think that's a good example of close working between a kind of entrepreneurial venture capital approach and a large public sector organisation coming together to kind of create a phenomenal industrial story for the UK.
But specifically in terms of the Mackintosh report's recommendations and how BEIS are going to approach innovation going forward, how much, if any, of the new approach is to do with changing a mindset about risk and a mindset about cost in the way that Kate was talking about?
So I haven't read Kate's interview. The approach in the Mackintosh report is to slowly try and change culture so that civil servants can feel more comfortable about taking risks. It's not going to be a kind of sudden change. The culture of the civil services, so it's a very large place, 400,000 people. But we are trying to kind of work with other initiatives to slowly change the culture to encourage people to think about risk.
I see Patrick has got his, I thought it was a blue hand, but Patrick's got a yellow hand up. I don't know what that signifies. Patrick, let's come to you.
Yeah, so I have no choice over the color of my hand. I just raised my hand and it happened to be yellow. So I just wanted to echo what Charles was saying there. I think a lot of this around venturing is around culture. And as we all know, culture takes time to change, particularly in large organizations. And fundamentally, it's about risk and therefore acceptance of failure. If you're going to take risk and take significant risk in the hope of being able to generate significant returns, part and parcel of that is you're going to have to accept failure. And you look at, I did read the Kate Bingham interview in the Financial Times and quite a lot of what else she said, because I think it's a very interesting model, which may well have wider applicability. The way the UK performed very well when going early and committing to vaccine production and so on. But I think part and parcel of that is taking a portfolio approach and accepting that you're going to place a number of bets. Some of them will succeed, hopefully some very well, but some of them are going to fail. And I think to have a culture where acceptance of failure is the norm, Charles can comment more on this, is perhaps more difficult to establish in the public sector than the private sector. It requires the right incentives, the right sort of mindsets to be in place. And that's why I think that fusion of public and private sector can be so powerful here, because the willingness to invest at risk, accept a degree of failure in return for outsized returns when you get it right, has to be part of the model. Otherwise, if the risk appetite isn't high enough, you won't do the things that are required to succeed in a more spectacular way when the opportunity presents itself.
I see that both Hetty and Ian have got their yellow hands up. But Patrick, let me just ask you one more question about that. I mean, it's obviously quite a lot easier to adopt a risk-based approach during a crisis, during a public health crisis. Even if you accept what Kate Bingham is saying as making quite a lot of sense, your point about culture is a really strong one, and I just wondered what you thought going forward about realistically how much the public sector is in practice going to change along the lines of the changes to risk that Kate was mentioning.
Well, I think if I just focus on a specific example of venturing, I think our experience has been really positive there. You look at Ferra, Axelos, Construction Line, and a number of others that I could mention. I think there has been a willingness to accept a degree of risk. Part of what the private sector partner does is accept some bearing of that risk. It makes an upfront capital investment in most cases to acquire a stake in the venture or purchase part of the value of the assets that are going to be monetized. So my experience is that through those sorts of partnerships, appropriate risk can be taken and well managed. So maybe it's more difficult to do purely in a public sector environment, but in models where we can get the right partnership working, my experience, and this is going back sort of 8 or 9 years now at Capita, is that it actually can be remarkably effective. And we probably need to do a better job of communicating those successes so people can see that the model really actually does work.
I mean, one of the things that Kate Bingham mentioned in her FT article was that for PR purposes, the government gets slammed and any time a project of theirs fails, whereas in a venture capital context, failure is kind of built into the model. So I mean, maybe the media also needs to rethink some of its approach.
Culture endures both in the media and elsewhere.
So Ian and Hetty have their hands up. Let's come to Ian first, then Hetty, and then Rebecca Jones, I think, in the audience has her hand up. So let's come to her third. Ian.
Yeah, okay. I agree with a lot of what's been said about culture, and certainly the experience of moving FERA into private sector has been much about shifting the cultures in that organization, and that is not something that happens quickly. However, I'm not sure I totally agree with Kate Bingham as a general concept. I mean, I think in specific circumstances, she's absolutely right. And of course, the circumstances she was talking about, she was absolutely right. That's self-evident. But the question is exactly what are those circumstances, and what are the barriers to creating those circumstances in the public sector? And I think they are substantial, actually. And I think that one of the consequences of COVID might actually be risk aversion rather than risk taking. The reality is that COVID has emerged out of governments actually taking risk, doing exactly what Kate Bingham said they should do, in that, you know, they are investing in a whole load of different things, but not in some other things. So they've made some choices, and there was risk sitting in that. Can you just expand on that?
Can you just expand on that a bit? The government's appetite for risk exacerbated the pandemic?
Oh, absolutely. Yeah, absolutely it did. You know, I was sitting in government as a chief scientific advisor saying, you've got all these risks here, which include pandemic risk, and you're not doing anything about them. You know, and I was there, I was saying that, and they weren't doing anything about it because the economists basically said that actually the cost of trying to mitigate those risks that might or might not happen at some time in the future are too great. So we're just going to take the risk. So, you know, I think that we'll see greater risk aversion rather than more risk taking. I think that's the reality of the public sector. You have to understand what government is there to do. Government is there to manage and organize. It's there to regulate. It's there to gather taxes. It's there to organize society. It's not there necessarily to drive economic performance. That's the market's role. Of course, government has a role in that, but it's not entirely government's role. And the question is, you know, when does the parts of government that have this role of driving economics, when do they overlap the marketplace, and how do you identify that? Kate Bingham was absolutely right in identifying it the way she did, but were there some characteristics that you could have said in advance that you can then apply more generally to lots of other circumstances where that might work? And I don't know the answer to that. I think we do need to know the answer to it before we can say just generally all the assets that government have, and our government needs to be more risk-taking in this context.
Okay, Hetty.
Yes, thank you. I'll be quick because I'm very conscious it's a question from the audience, and that's probably the priority. But I just wanted to pick up again on another point around the culture change. The culture change here is massive. You know, I've come from a career of 30 years working in driving transformational change across large enterprise. I kind of know what culture change is and how hard it is to do. One of the big culture shifts that we've got here, in order to drive better and faster exploitation of the innovation that we've got, is twofold, and they're interconnected. The first is the fact that the people working within the government tend to be more risk averse anyway, and therefore our innovators, our inventors, are much less likely than they are in the university sector to want to leave the public sector and go on the journey with their innovation into a spin out. So there's a lot lower propensity there in terms of the innovator following their innovation, which is a big problem because it means that the risk of that innovation not getting to market is much higher. Coupled with that, and the two interplay and sort of create a danger of self-fulfilling outcome, is that Government is very nervous about giving away equity in the spin-outs that we create. So, you know, we've got a history, we've done 14 spin-outs in Ploughshare. Historically, we've been very, very reluctant to relinquish equity in those spin-outs, and we sort of give it away begrudgingly as investors come along. It's sort of the philosophy, and we certainly have not been doing the thing we should be doing, which is to give significant chunks of founder equity to the inventors. So it's something we're facing into right now, because in order to scale and drive the kind of ambition that we've got at Ploughshare and to meet the needs of the Mackintosh report, we need to flip that on its head. We need to create a culture and an environment where inventors really want to take the risk and go with the innovation. To do that, we need to be able to give them sizable chunks of equity. To do that, we need to face into the debate within government around, are we prepared to take that risk? It's seen as a risk. I don't see it as a risk. I actually see the risk being fundamentally in not giving founders enough equity and therefore having spin-outs that are simply uninvestable. So again, another example of how culture, both at a ground roots level as well as a sort of government wider level, kind of almost interplay and create a self-fulfilling prophecy, which is unhelpful in terms of exploitation of innovation.
Okay, I mean, I have about 4 or 5 follow-up questions, but we've only got 5 minutes left. So can we come to Rebecca now to get her perspective? Hi, Rebecca.
Hi, good morning. Thank you. And thank you for hosting this a really interesting event, and all the speakers are fantastic. It's been a great discussion. So I work at DSTL, so Hetty's mentioned the Defence Science and Technology Laboratories. I also sit on the Ploughshare board alongside Hetty, and my role currently is Strategic Partnerships Leader of DSTL's brand new division. So we've just set up a new division which is called Exploration Division. And that's one of the reasons why I'm here, because it's very, very relevant to the type of work that we're trying to do for Ministry of Defence, but also other government departments as well. And we essentially identify, assess and promote novel concepts, technology and ideas to give us that sort of game-changing advantage. And it's in line with recent strategies about going after generation after next science and technology. And at its heart, we're trying to build a culture all about collaboration. So everything that we've talked about today is really, really, really pertinent to my role. Collaboration with industry, academia, other government sort of innovation labs, and international as well. And we're trying to get ways to have those sort of quick and easy ways to just run brainstorms, hackathons, you know, all of those sorts of things to get the different minds together to collaborate and come up with ideas. And we're also trying to build a culture of risk-taking. And failing fast, failing early, which is a phrase I think someone mentioned earlier. So all of this is very relevant. My point, however, is culture is, as it's been mentioned, very, very difficult to change. But also coupled with that is we're sort of operating with a business model and a quite old-fashioned operating model of, you know, money coming in, long-term defence research projects that go on for years and years and years, and then out pops a new capability, and then you put it in the hands of the user. So that's our sort of operating model that we're trying to work with, and it's very, very difficult. So I think, yes, we've got the culture change problem, but I think government, this is a generalisation, but government sometimes can have quite an old-fashioned operating model, which inhibits that true collaboration and sort of quick and easy risk-taking, failing fast, failing early approach, which in some circumstances is the right approach to take. So yeah, there's some of the challenges that we're facing at the moment.
That's really,
there is appetite.
No, that's really interesting, Rebecca. And are you more optimistic now than you were, say, a year ago or 2 years ago? Where's the direction of travel for you?
Oh, absolutely more optimistic now. I think all of the MOD science and technology strategy, you know, that you mentioned earlier on, the Prime Minister's supercharging science. We've just put out, well, our chief executive has just put out an industry day all about supercharging science and technology for the UK. So absolutely, I'm optimistic. And I think COVID, I agree with the comments earlier, COVID has helped. And I think what's been really beneficial is that everyone has got the same common goal. And I think that is key. You know, when government and private sector have got the same common goal and you're in a crisis, you can come together and work really well and get the outcomes. Obviously, that's not always sustainable because you don't want to be in a crisis all the time, but we can certainly learn from that and be more open about what government's objectives are.
Thank you so much for coming on and giving us your thoughts. Well, I thought it would be good to round off the session, if we could, by coming to Andrew Mackintosh himself, who can tell us a little bit about the attitude that he found in government when he was compiling his report. And Andrew, are you around? Hi.
Hi. Hi, everyone.
Thanks for joining us.
No, I'm really delighted to to see the conversation beginning to open up now that the report's out there. It's been a long time in gestation, and there've been a lot of good reasons for that. You know, not starting with Brexit, changes of government, and COVID. So, I mean, I think it's a measure of the importance of government attached to this opportunity, that it has actually survived all of that, and it is out there now. So I'm really pleased to hear the conversation, and that's why I'm trying to keep quiet most of the time, because I'm learning a lot from other people's reaction. But this issue of culture was at the heart of the report. We didn't talk about the 3 pillars in the report, but the central pillar of that is a chapter on incentives. And very early on in the work that I was doing with Charles and others in the Treasury, it was quite clear that the standard response was, this is not my day job, what you're proposing, and anyway, the Treasury will pinch all the upside if we do anything remotely entrepreneurial. And in fact, in my first week, one person said to me, well, my department is under legislation is not allowed to think the way you're asking me to think. So there's some fairly fundamental cultural issues that have to be addressed. And the whole point of the incentives chapter is to start sending different messages to the heads of government departments that it is okay and it's necessary under managing public money and the efficient use of assets of all sorts to start thinking about the use of their assets in a broader way. And then that's one strand. And then the other strand of the incentives is working with the Treasury to say, listen, you need a more mature way of approaching entrepreneurial activity within government departments so that there is an incentive for them to engage in this activity. And the elements are there in the report. How much of that we can actually sort of solidify into the mechanisms of government, that's for the BEIS team. That's exactly what they're working on at the moment. But I think what this session today has reinforced to me is that culture is first, second, and third on this list.
And just before we go, Andrew, can you just talk a little bit about how you see joint ventures like Axilos and private companies like Capita, but not just Capita, helping in terms of providing some of those incentives and some of the upsides and the downsides of integrating the private sector more closely?
Well, I think that's been covered pretty well by the other speakers, and many of them have more experience of interacting with government in that sort of way. So I think, as I think Patrick said, there are a lot of different models there, and what's important for government is that it is seen to be fair for the taxpayer. Whatever model is chosen needs to produce an appropriate return, and that return is clearly financial importance, but again, in the report, there's some early work on how do you judge returns both financially, economically, and socially, and how do you put a mix together? How do you start to calibrate opportunities in that sort of way? Because of course, government is after more than financial return.
Thank you so much. Well, I mean, it's been an absolutely enlightening discussion. Thank you so much for everyone who joined us. I have to say, when I first read the Kate Bingham interview in the FT, I said, of course, that's exactly what we should be doing. Of course, it's obvious. And I suppose this discussion has really thrown up the complexities of the reality of how to stimulate innovation. And as Andrew said, culture is not something that can be changed overnight, but there are obviously models that can and should be explored. And it seems like quite an exciting time from everyone we've heard from Hetty and from Charles. There seems to be a sort of substantial turning point in how the government approaches innovation going forward. So hopefully over the next 12 to 24 months, whether as a result of COVID or not, there are interesting times in this sector. We're going to have more think-ins going forward to do with the great opportunity and to do with Capita's work in this area. We really hope that you join us for them. Thank you so much to Hetty, to Patrick, to Sir Ian, to Charles, to Andrew, and to Rebecca, and to everyone else who joined us today. I hope you have a wonderful day.